Welcome to Session 2 of Revelation. This lesson begins on page 20 of your participant workbook.
Apocalyptic was written about 300 years, from about 200 BC to about AD 100. After the Jews began to leave Palestine and the Christians became basically a Gentile organization, the apocalyptic connections with Palestine and the Jews, was severed. And it didn't take but about 2 generations for people to not know how to interpret apocalyptic anymore. The great church father Irenaeus, toward the end of the second Christian century, commenting on the book of Revelation, talked about how wonderful and great and majestic some of these figures were, but in essence said, we ain't got a clue as to how to interpret this. And the church has struggled with the interpretation of Revelation ever since. There's a marvelous book that I think is out of print now, but if you ever get a chance to get hold of it, or if it comes back into print, it's very, very good. It's written by Arthur Wainwright, who is retired from the faculty at one of our rivals, Marianne, down at Emory and Candler. And he wrote this book entitled Mysterious Apocalypse. And he goes through each of the Christian centuries and how they wrestle with the problem of how in the world do you interpret this, because they had lost the handle. But for the people between 200 BC and 100 AD, they would have understood it. It was just a part of their culture. Let me give you an analogy, an illustration. Most of us, not maybe every last single one, but almost everybody in our culture understands political cartoons, don't they? I mean, it's a part of our culture. They are kind of exaggerated. They're kind of gross, some of them. They are all kinds of weird drawings and so on and so forth, but they're usually all symbolic to a certain extent, aren't they? But we understand them because they are part of our culture, part of our thinking. For example, if during the 70s you had seen a political cartoon with a huge peanut with a big toothy smile, everybody would have known that was. If you during the 80s had seen a political cartoon with an old cowboy with boots and a 10-gallon hat, riding on a horse and kind of jowls hanging down, everybody would have known that was. In the 90s, if you had seen a giant zipper, I rest my case. You know the drill, don't you? You understand the symbolism, don't you? Well, they did too. They did too. So this idea, well, they wouldn't have understood any of that. Well, they certainly did. Because if they hadn't, we wouldn't be studying this book today. Because the people would have said, what is that? It doesn't mean anything to us. We'll just junk it. But because they did understand it, and because it was a great help to them during a time of persecution, then of course, it was preserved. And it was preserved, and as you probably know, the book of Revelation had a great deal of difficulty finally making its way into the canon. Why? Because they had lost the key to how to understand it. And the church wasn't quite sure whether they ought to put a book in that they weren't quite sure how to interpret. But the figures in the book of God and Christ and the victory over evil, which anybody just about can see, those figures were so magnificent that the church didn't want to lose them. And so they finally did incorporate Revelation into the canon. The Western Church, at the end of the 4th century, it took another 100 years for the Eastern Church to accept it, but it is canon in both places. It has been canon in both places since those times, as it were. Now, let me shift gears just a tad and talk a little bit about the method of interpretation that most of you have grown up with and has become a kind of popular way of looking at and interpreting and handling the book of Revelation through the years. It doesn't go back to Jesus. It goes back to an old Irishman named John Nelson Darby. Darby was a John Nelson. Darby was a brilliant young man, born in 1800 in London. He was an Irishman. Irishman born in London, you know we got trouble. But Darby was brilliant, and he studied the law. And he was admitted to practice at the bar at a very, very young age. But he became very soon disillusioned with law and turned to religion. And he studied then to become a priest of the Church of England, which he did, and was given his first appointment in 1827 to a church in Dublin, Ireland. Very soon after that appointment, in 1827, he had an accident with his horse. His horse got too close to a pole or a side of a building or something and really just tore his leg all to pieces. It was really a very serious thing. It even required surgery. And you can imagine what surgery was like in 1827. It ain't no picnic now, is it? But 1827, it took him a year and a half to recover and convalesce from that accident and the subsequent surgery and the healing and so on and so forth. And so during that time, Darby, you know, was not the type of person who would sit around and watch Oprah and the soaps all day, even if he had them back then. But he decided to set himself the task of studying something that would help him in his ministry when he was able to pick up his ministry again. And so he decided that he would study the Scripture. And to us, that just sounds like, well, what else? Because we think of the Scripture as foundational, or most of us do, foundational to our faith. Understanding the Scripture is spiritually a blessing, and so on and so forth. But remember, we're talking the Anglican Church in the early 1800s. And you do realize, as we said before, and again, I'm not putting anybody down, that the Roman Catholic tradition and the Anglican tradition, which is very close to the Catholic tradition, did not at that time, and even to this day to a certain degree, they do not emphasize the importance of the study of Scripture. They can tell you all about liturgy. They can tell you all about sacraments. They can tell you all about the books of common worship and all of those kinds of things. But Scripture, they just don't know much about that. And again, they will tell you that themselves, and they are taking steps to improve that situation. So when Darby decided to study Scripture way back yonder, that was sort of, how shall we put it, that was sort of a daring kind of thing, as it were. So he did. And he studied Scripture, and in 1829 he sort of came to the following conclusions. And let me give them to you right quickly, and we'll talk more about them a little bit later and how they connect with the book of Revelation. First of all, Darby came to the conclusion that the Scripture was the inspired revelation of God. Something that the church basically has affirmed through the years, but if you're not studying it, then you think of it as not very important, do you? So Darby said, hey, this is a very important document here. It is the revelation of God to us. Secondly, he believed that because it was the revelation of God, it had to be taken literally. Everything literally across the board. And when it was pointed out to him that he himself did not take everything literally, he said, well, when I don't, I take the plain meaning of the text, which he got to tell you what it was, as it were. Thirdly, he believed that the Scripture was an account of God's dealing with the whole created order all the way from creation to the end of creation. And he believed that the history of the world and God's dealing with the world was divided into ages, or they call them dispensations, as it were. And that God deals differently with the human race in various and sundry dispensations. We are through with almost all of them except perhaps the last one. And we are teetering on the brink of the last one. So, because he believed that everything in the Scripture had to be understood literally, anything in the Scripture that looked as if it was a prediction of something, and he did not know whether it had been fulfilled, was obviously a prediction of the future. And since we're right at the end times, it would be a prediction of something that would happen at the end times. Now, that's his presupposition. So in the history of the church, the church had always wrestled with the return of Jesus. The term, as you know, in the New Testament, with regard to the return of Jesus, is the word parousia, but we've anglicized it into parousia. That has to do with the return of Jesus and the wrapping up of history. Now, for whatever reason, the church somehow or other connected chapter 20 of Revelation with the return of Jesus, even though there's not a single thing in the chapter 20 to indicate anything about Jesus coming. But nonetheless, the church got this together. They believed somehow or another that the parousia was connected with the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus with the saints. The church believed that 1,000-year reign began when the church was created and would go for 1,000 years, and then the parousia would come. And that's what is known as post-millenarianism or post-millennialism, namely that Jesus comes after the 1,000-year reign of Jesus with the saints here on earth. Well, you can imagine what was going on in 995 and 996 and 997. We had a Y1K problem. And people were getting real antsy about that. And 1,000 came and went, and 1,100 came and went, and 1,200 came and went. And they said, this must be a symbolic number. They didn't know that back then in a way that we do today, but they said, this must be a symbolic number. And so therefore, they said, okay, it's going to come. The church in the world is still the millennial kingdom, and Jesus will return after that's over. That, you see, they retain what was called post-millennialism. Well, Darby comes along at a time when the Church of England was not having its finest hour. It was not what we would call an exemplar for the church's behavior for us to emulate, as it were. In the 1700s, there was a group of folk who pulled out of the Anglican Church for that very reason. I believe they were called Methodists. I do believe that's the case. And they didn't start as a separatist movement, as I understand it. I'm not as much up on Methodist history as some of my colleagues are, since I'm a totally depraved Presbyterian, so, not a growing to perfection Methodist. Of course, when I tell that to my students, they want to sign up with me. But that's another matter. But at any rate, this was just not a good time for the Anglican Church. And so Darby says, hey, the church can't be the millennial kingdom. And he came to that conclusion for two reasons. One, because he saw a church that was shot through with lots of human foibles and sinfulness, unlike today when the church is perfect. But he saw that. And further, Darby had come to the conclusion that God deals with the world through Israel, through the Jews, and that Jesus was sent as the Messiah to set up the millennial kingdom back in the time when he came. But the Jews did not cooperate. They rejected him as being Messiah. They turned him over to the Romans and had him executed. And then the church emerged. Well, Darby, in a sense, says that the church was the creation was an interim creation. He likes to call it a parenthesis. And therefore, the church is going to serve its purpose, being in the world for a while, until the church degenerates from being almost perfect to being almost totally rotten and corrupt, which means that it's got to be taken out of the world. It's got to be gotten rid of. At which time, God will go back to dealing with the world through Israel again. So, what is called the postmillennial understanding, Darby changed into what is called the premillennial understanding. Namely, the church in the world right now cannot be the millennial kingdom. The church has served its purpose. It has deteriorated. It will be gotten rid of. And after it is gotten rid of, Jesus will return and set up the 1,000-year reign of Jesus with the saints in Jerusalem. And that particular kingdom will be a kingdom of Jews. Now, this is pure Darbyism. You say, yeah, I've heard something like that, but not exactly that. Well, we'll get to that after the break. But suffice it to say, you got to get rid of the church. Then Jesus returns pre-1,000 years, pre-millennially. Sets up a 1,000-year reign of Jesus with the saints, and then history will come to an end. Well, that's basic to Darbyism. There are some other things that are a part of that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in 1829, Darby actually turned in his credentials. This church is too rotten and corrupt for me. And he allied himself with a small group of little cell units that people who had pulled out of the church and were trying to meet together, to pray together, to support each other, to have Bible study, and so on. And that particular little group later became known as the Plymouth Brethren. And Darby became the spokesperson and the major theologian for that particular group of folk in that particular time and place. Well, you say all of that's over there in England and Ireland. How did it get here? Tune in after the break.